talking about critical crossroads. Can STEM save us? But I think more apt name for the speech would be, can just STEM save us? We are teetering at the edge of impending climate catastrophe. We must face the fact that humanity might end. Yet we know the facts. We know that just last year, we passed the vaulted 1.5 degrees Celsius mark. That means scientists were saying that if we pass this mark, climate change, the effects of climate change might be irreversible. We know that if we continue this pathway, by the end of the 21st century, we might exceed 4 degrees Celsius of climate change compared to pre-industrial levels. And this wreaks huge economic problems. That being trillions of dollars of lost economic productivity, of direct responses to climate catastrophes. And yet, one of the most important parts of this is the fact that there's a huge global disparity. That the countries that produce the most amount of CO2, the countries that accelerate climate change the most, are suffering the least amount of impacts. And vice versa. Countries that don't produce as much CO2, that don't accelerate climate change as much, are facing the least amount of impacts. As you can see here, we see countries that were previously colonized having the highest impacts through climate change. And countries that were previous colonizers and still colonizers are facing the least amount of impacts. Yet, we shouldn't be surprised. This fact of the countries that were previous colonizers facing the least amount of economic problems is not unique to just climate change. It is just colonialism. It is the fact that the logics of capital must dictate that, for example, we can think of the diamonds, the Beards company. So you couldn't really tell American civil society to stop buying diamonds, even though we know that these diamonds are taken through these enslaved labor of Africans, right? And this effect, even though colonialism has still had ended, on paper, still dictates a lot about how economic impacts are distributed across the globe. And I think a really important part of how we interpret STEM is the fact that we think of our education, our current education, the colleges we as TAMS students are going to go to, as neutral bodies. We think of them as places where we're going to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge. We're going to gain this sort of education of fact and logic. However, what we've seen is that these education institutions have further and further become antithetical to our idea of learning. They have, for example, protesters of the Palestinian genocide had their degrees revoked from Columbia, right? And so when we think about trying to get a STEM education, we shouldn't really be thinking about trying to separate ourselves from ethics. A lot of STEM majors, a lot of really famous scientists would say ethics is not really my field. Ethics is not something I deal with. However, the fact is that when we derive the sort of STEM education that is separated from ethics, that is separated from the world around us, we see why we have continuously been telling our politicians, our government, that the facts of climate change, yet there hasn't been any sort of movement towards climate change being reduced, to the impacts of climate change being mitigated. And the reason for that is not because we need to get better facts, or we need to get more persuasive facts. It's the fact that we should be really, instead of learning how to learn facts, logic, education, we should be learning how to learn to critique, to deconstruct, to demystify. And I think an important part of that is something that Thomas Kuhn once said. All significant breakthroughs are break with old ways of education. So when we think about scholarship, we should really rebuke the scholarship and Western-centric domain of scientific inquiry. So what is that? What I mean when I say that we should reject this? What I mean is, instead of thinking about science as something that just continuously throughout history improving our lives, even though in some capacity it has, we should instead sort of critique the idea that derived from the Enlightenment, that science is only for good. That when we think about sort of placing this ameliorative framework around science, that science always makes society better, that after every single scientific revolution, we get better and better through social issues get better, class issues get better. We should instead be starting to think, how and why this climate catastrophe hasn't been solved. How we can start incorporating the lived experiences of those who suffer the most from climate change, instead of regurgitating these facts about how climate change is getting worse and worse through numbers. We should instead be starting to think, how can I myself and how can I, community organizing, actually have a chance for to mitigate climate change, to actually make the human species live on, right? And so what the real premise of my talk is, and why I say can just STEM save us, is I think a lot of our education is about, as TAM students, is about learning all these STEM topics and applying them to the job field, and never really escaping this framework of the fact that the idea that science is scientific progress is always good is not necessarily a idea that is uncritical. That there has been critiques of the idea of science being the silos of science being ameliorative. And so when we approach these 21st century problems, we should, instead of thinking of science as the main pathway towards trying to save the human race, we should instead be trying to think of how can we apply both the things we know because of science, but also the things we know because we are people. The things we know because those who are oppressed feel those, right? So we should be able to incorporate both of those to create not necessarily a more persuasive argument for why we should be mitigating climate change, because we already know we should be mitigating climate change, but be able to think outside the box of government and of action that is simply regurgitating policy. We should instead be able to take it into our own hands, to say, if the government won't shut down this one oil well, we should shut it down ourselves. Because we have been telling the people that control the government for 50 years that climate change is a problem, yet still nothing really of significance has been done. In fact, it has gotten even worse. It has accelerated even more. So, thank you this is my TED Talk. Thanks.